Good evening to all our members, friends, and guests. My name is Shlomit Yadin Gadot. I'm a member of the scientific committee in the Tel Aviv Institute for Contemporary Psychoanalysis. And I want to welcome our distinguished authors, Alberto Fergusson and Miguel Gutiérrez. We are very honored to have you all here with us today. I would like to invite the chair of our training committee, Professor Ofrit Berman-Shapira, to offer her greetings and open this evening. As the chair of our institute, Simi Talmi could not be with us today. Ofrit, please.
Hi, good evening, and welcome for everyone. When I was asked to replace Simi, I was more than happy to do so. In honor of Aner and all the people who have collaborated in writing this book. Aner, together with Dr. Tair Kaspi and with Yael Peri-Hertovic, are responsible for this important and exciting publishing venture titled Routledge Introduction to Contemporary Psychoanalysis. Professor Aner Govrin is the chief editor of this series of books and responsible for bringing some of the most famous psychoanalytic theorists, writers, and concepts to old and hopefully to new audiences. The books to be published in this series will allow the readers to get familiar with updated ideas and thinking, focusing on contemporary psychoanalysis, concepts and concerns, covering from the unconscious and dreams, projective identification and eating disorders, through neuropsychoanalysis, colonialism, and spiritual sensitive psychoanalysis. Some of the books will also be dedicated to prominent figures in the field, such as Melanie Klein, Jacques Lacan, SÁNDOR FERENCZI, to whom we are dedicating this evening, as well as Otto Kernberg and Michael Eigen. 9 books have already been published, and many more are due to be published in the near future. The beautiful cover of the books, of all of them, has been artfully designed by Michal Heyman, who is an internationally acclaimed Israeli artist, who is also a member of the Tel Aviv Institute. Professor Aner Govrin is a leading psychoanalyst, a researcher at the Bar-Ilan University, the founder of an established psychoanalytic program at that university, and a writer himself who has published numerous papers and books. He's an experienced clinician, a philosopher, and a theorist. Aner studies the formation of psychoanalytic knowledge and the cultural and philosophical context of psychoanalytic theories. His studies have led him to develop a theory of attachment and moral judgment, and his most recent book is titled Ethics and Attachment, How We Make Moral Judgment. What Aner does throughout his career is what I perceive to be the best and most significant way to keep psychoanalysis alive and kicking. Re-examining the treasures our mothers and fathers have left us is possibly the only way, or at least the best way I can think of to keep their thinking alive and relevant. Aner uses the ideas or concept of enchantment and critics or distress to conceptualize the way all of us approach ideas and knowledge. To keep thinking alive, one needs to be able to do both. We need to be able to be enchanted by our ancestors and to marvel at their contributions. But in order to be able to use their thinking in a liveful way, we also need to be able to see what is missing from their thinking and what needs to be added to it in order to make it relevant to our days, to our cultures and ethics. Given one without the other, and we may contribute to the untimely death of ideas and knowledge. Playing is always in the present, and it has to do with one's ability to reinvent anew something that is already there. The thrill, love, and imagination that is put into one's playing is what makes her or his life worth living. Aner does all of this and helps us to do it as well. He seems to always be on the go, studying, thinking, reconceptualizing, honoring, criticizing psychoanalysis. By doing all of this, he makes psychoanalysis accessible to new and old audiences, enabling us to play anew with old material. It is not a coincidence that this evening is celebrating a book that was created across oceans and cultures. There could be no better way to celebrate Aner's work, FERENCZI, and psychoanalysis in general. Two professors from an esteemed university in Colombia and a professor from an esteemed university in Israel, not to mention esteemed psychoanalytic institutes, have joined heads and hands to rethink FERENCZI's work, which is a huge celebration of psychoanalytic thinker who himself is known for his ability to integrate and to be enchanted with his father's Freud thinking and to break free from it. This is the only way I can think of to keep psychoanalysis alive and relevant, to be both enchanted and grateful for the inheritance we have all been left by our parents, but to also do our best to break free creatively and without erasing history. Aner bridges time, the present joins hands and heads with the past and cultures, showing us how great heads think alike or together. The world that Aner contributes to is small enough so we can feel its intimacy and big enough so we can experience its endless possibilities. And for that, I both congratulate Aner and also I'm extremely thankful. I wish all of us a wonderful evening.
Thank you, Ofrit. I would like to invite Dr. Alejandro Chaine, rector of the Universidad del Rosario, to offer his greetings.
Hello, good afternoon in Colombia and good evening in Israel. It's an honor for me to be with you today in this book launching as president of Rosario University. And it's a pleasure to be, for me, with Alberto Fergusson, member of the Conciliatura, the board of Rosario University, colegial honorario, and professor of the School of Medicine and Health Sciences. Miguel Gutiérrez, professor of the School of Medicine and Health Sciences from Rosario University too. Simi Talmi, chair from Tel Aviv Institute for Contemporary Psychoanalysis. It's really important for me and for our university to be able to do this book launching with important allies in this discipline as the Tel Aviv Institute for Contemporary Psychoanalysis. Aner Govrin, editor of the book, Shlomit Yadlin Gadot, and Dr. Gila Ofer. Finally, I greet our students, professors, and alumni who are with us today, and people from Israel and other countries that are watching in this moment, this streaming. For me, as a president of Rosario University, as I said, it's an honor to be here in the launching of the book, SÁNDOR FERENCZI, Contemporary Introduction, published by professors and doctors Alberto Fergusson and Miguel Gutiérrez. I would like to start introducing our university. Our university, it's an institution with 368 years of history located in the city of Bogotá, Colombia. We work every day in our university to provide an ethical, humanistic, and scientific education that, together with research and appropriate and demanding teaching, allows this educational community to fully form outstanding people. And of course, to act for the benefit of society with a maximum sense of responsibility. Additionally, with our strategic planning, we work as a university that transforms ideas into innovations at the service of the common good. And this is part of the essence known in Latin as nova et better, always antique and always new. We respect our history, but we develop innovations to help our country. Innovation and tradition in our teaching process, research projects, and extension initiatives. As I said before, I wanted to start talking about our university because I think that the authors of this book represent this hallmark of Rosario University. The publication of this book reaffirms the importance of psychoanalysis in our Rosario University, and of course in Colombia, considering that it analyzes the life and work of one of the most important psychoanalysts of all times, SÁNDOR FERENCZI. Professors Fergusson and Gutiérrez present in this book the life and work of FERENCZI, his discovery of psychoanalysis, the novelties he introduced to the discipline, and his great contribution to the democratization of psychoanalysis. However, I would like to emphasize the influence of this book for the next generations of psychoanalysts, because the task of the two authors will be to ensure the appropriation of the information presented. Academic products such as these improve our teaching and learning processes, not only allow our professors to improve the research projects produced at the university, but also to articulate this research process with teaching process. The challenge after this launch is that our students can appropriate this information and this publication for their academic career. Without a doubt, the main process is to guarantee that our students can understand and learn the life of SÁNDOR FERENCZI. Because as I always say, people learn at all times, from all people and everywhere. And we have to do the same in our School of Medicine and Health Sciences from our university with FERENCZI's life. I don't want to take much more time to talk because I think that the protagonists are our authors, Dr. Fergusson and Dr. Gutiérrez. I want to recognize their job in our university because they have been working for many years in the Center of Psychosocial Studies, making more visible this important discipline. As a president, I'm very proud to be at this launching, and we reaffirm Rosario University commitment to academic dissemination with products such as this book, because it recognizes our institutional strategy to internationalization and, of course, academic excellence. Thank you very much, and congratulations again, Dr. Alberto Fergusson and Dr. Miguel Gutiérrez.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chen. As you said, we congratulate today the authors, Alberto Fergusson and Miguel Gutiérrez, and their editor, Ania Gouvrin, and the launching of their book, A Contemporary Introduction to SÁNDOR FERENCZI. The authors will present their book to us, and this will be followed by a commentary delivered by Dr. Gila Ofer about the book's relevance to contemporary psychoanalysis. We will then hold a conversation between the authors and their editor, and we invite our audience, all of you, to join in and add their thoughts and questions to this conversation. At any time throughout the evening, all participants are invited to write questions and thoughts in the chat, and Aner or I will present them to the authors during this conversation. And just a word before we begin, for whomever hasn't had the chance yet to read the book, it consists of 40,000 words, an extremely short book. And how does one go about introducing an immense theorist in a short book of 40,000 words? Just for knowing something about how to achieve such a feat, I would warmly recommend reading this book. I think that most writers know that often enough, it's easier to write a longer lecture, a longer article or book than a shorter one. But someone willing to face the challenge may achieve the effect of crystallization, clarity, and acumen that characterize this book. Fergusson and Gutiérrez in my reading really have managed to portray a great theorist, SÁNDOR FERENCZI, from various perspectives. They've captured an image of the man, his temperament, his complexity and singularity. They have weaved him into the theoretic and political history of psychoanalysis, marked influences that shaped his thinking, and outlined some of his significant relationships with Sigmund Freud, among others. All this is given in this book alongside a clear description of the evolution of Ferenczi's ideas, main ideas, his belief in therapy, his innovations in technique, his startlingly contemporary ideas about introjection, splitting, trauma, enactment, dissociation, and re-traumatization. I don't know if it was meant to be so, but reading the book, I felt not only its theoretic wealth, but also its relevance to our times. The authors point out that psychoanalysis, in its search for the individual and unique voice, has always been perceived as subversive for political institutions and systems. The voice of the individual, by definition, will always hold more and less than the power structures surrounding it demand. Ferenczi, as a man, highlights the boldness needed to outstrip the constraints of authority and the innovative nature that is a safeguard against dogma. His belief in spontaneity and authenticity, his pursuit of integrity anchored in self-knowledge, guarded him from arrogance, stagnation, and power struggles. He believed that everything important that happens in the world happens in the space between the me and the you, the self and the other. Today, acknowledged as a maternal rather than a paternal ancestor of psychoanalysis, Ferenczi recognized and welcomed his innate femininity. He saw clearly how not only psychoanalysis, but probably the world at large, depends on our ability to adapt to each other. From birth onwards, Ferenczi could see how a subject's life force may be either strengthened or extinguished by his other. He believed in human nature, believed that even madness may function as Orpha, as guardian angel, meant to preserve life at all costs. I would like to thank our authors for bringing these beliefs and insights to us, for making them accessible and present in our global and our analytic here and now. And I would now like to invite Alberto Fergusson to introduce us to this book, but I will first introduce him. Alberto Fergusson, MD, is a psychiatrist and psychoanalyst working in Colombia and in the US since 1982. He has been the head and founder of the Institute of Accompanied Self-Rehabilitation, a program whose main objective is to accompany homeless people diagnosed with severe psychosis, helping them become independent and productive members of community. Professor Fergusson is an advocate of the human rights of the so-called mentally ill, and he has developed accompanied self-rehabilitation, also called accompanied auto-analysis, a unique alternative to traditional psychiatric treatments. He's the founder of Fungrata in Colombia and FAS in Washington, DC, innovative institutions developing therapeutic strategies for the rehabilitation of the so-called mentally ill. Professor Fergusson has worked on the concepts of therapeutic towns and mutual recovery. He's been actively involved in the peace process in Colombia, in the negotiations with the National Liberation Army, and currently is advisor of the president of the Truth Commission, Father Francisco de Roy. I don't know if I said the name right, but he's worked as a consultant for the Department of Mental Health in Washington, DC and Middlebury, Vermont, teaching the method of accompanied self-rehabilitation. He's full professor of the Universidad del Rosario in Colombia, where he has created and directs the Center for Psychosocial Studies. He's one of the founding members of the Colombian group Aparatos in Psychoanalysis, which means openings in psychoanalysis, and one of the sponsors of this event. Alberto, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sholmeet, and thanks to everybody. You can't imagine how big a pleasure it is for us, Miguel and for myself, to be here All of you who have written books, you know what it means, all the hard work. So I would like to thank one by one, but fortunately, all the crucial people that have made this meeting possible have already been mentioned. So I just add my gratitude to all of those who made this book and this event possible. Thank you very much for that. And I certainly want to thank Alejandro Cheney, our president of the university, for being here today. His support and the university support was very important in developing all the ideas that we are now being able to share to you with Miguel. I will talk briefly. I'll basically try to share with you the spirit of our book, the general, the global idea that we want to share with you, and Miguel will go more specifically into some of the main points that we kind of talk about in the book. I have 9 points to talk to you about, and that's what I'm going to do today. The first thing is what I'm calling the pattern. What's the pattern? The pattern is that when we study the life of Sándor Ferenczi, we know that his story, his life, his role in psychoanalysis, what happened to him, the process he has undergone throughout the years now is very typical in many psychoanalytic societies. And we need to mention that. Many analysts, and Ferenczi that happened to Ferenczi for a while, is what happened to him is what we want to call, he was kind of buried alive somehow. Buried alive, we mean someone whose ideas have been forgotten without really being disproven. That happened for a while with Ferenczi, for many years. And that's what we call he was buried alive. This has happened to many great thinkers in our intellectual story of humanity, by the way, but it did happen to Ferenczi. And not only was he kind of buried alive, but there's what we call the forced disappearance, no? Using this analogy with what happens in wars, in which someone's ideas are actively getting rid of. No, this happened to Ferenczi, and some, like Ferenczi, have been lucky enough to have undergone some sort of resurrection after many years. But I'm pointing this, I'm talking about this because we know now that many analysts in many societies, maybe their ideas have never been resurrected and we've lost them. And maybe there's still time to really do something about those people because of the dynamics of all the psychoanalytic movement, people who have done great contributions and we don't really know about them. When we talk about this disappearance, we must remember, let me just tell you an example with Ferenczi. We all know that he was probably dead in psychoanalysis until the publication of his clinical diary in 1932, as we all know. It seems that Freud and other analysts played a very active role in omitting the publication in English of Ferenczi's paper, you know, called Confusing of Tongues Between the Adult and the Child. Ernest Jones told Ferenczi that he had translated his paper and that it would be published in the following volume of the International Journal of Psychoanalysis. We know that after Ferenczi's death in May 1933, he changed his mind, and Joan Rivière supported him. And they thought that now that Ferenczi had died, it probably was not worth the idea of publishing his books. Why am I mentioning this? I'm not just because of Ferenczi, but this is a story, as I mentioned, that is relatively common in psychoanalytic history. Although there's no evidence of Freud's response to Jones and Rivière's petition, but the truth is that the paper was not published. It was not until 1949, 60 years later, that a version of the paper in English, translated by Michael Balint, will be finally made public. Those who have been disappeared or buried alive are typically people who, up to a certain point, have been slightly ahead of their own time. Probably that's the reason. People who dare to say things that many others are about to say, but they don't say. And that's something that we have to look into our current history. And we emphasize slightly because they usually say things that others have them, let's say, preconscious, to use Freud's language. We find that ideas that have been buried alive and disappeared are sometimes many years later published by other analysts. That's also part of our history, frequently without quoting the initial one. It can be accepted, of course, that this can happen because of real ignorance, due precisely to the fact that they were disappeared. Not every disappeared analyst has had the luck, as I was saying, of FERENCZI in being subject to a real process of resurrection. Many will probably remain disappeared forever, like it happens in most wars. And that's when I want to talk a bit about what we like to call Viennese psychoanalysis. In Viennese psychoanalysis, we see many authors, many peoples, many writings that have disappeared. And I think it's time that we look into them and understand many of their ideas, but not only their ideas, of their attitudes. Psychoanalysis initially was absolutely linked to all the disciplines of psychoanalysis. You remember Freud's article on the multiple interests of psychoanalysis. That is true. And that's another way, that's something that we learned from Viennese psychoanalysts, and maybe have been forgetting about that for a while. FERENCZI is an example of this, what we call Viennese psychoanalysis, meaning a psychoanalyst that likes to go, as we like to say, beyond the couch, that what's learned in the couch is also used in some way or another to help society in many different areas, in many different disciplines. Probably, and this is my fifth point, as you all remember the book by Jacob Russell about the repression of psychoanalysis, which mainly talks about the history of Otto Fenikel. That's a good example of what happens. People and psychoanalysis becomes kind of adapted to society, and it loses sometimes many of its more important attitudes and way to help people in really different ways, in really different fields. Probably the other book that helps us to understand that is the book by Loscher and Newton, Unorthodox Freud, where they show very clearly that what we call orthodox psychoanalysis has really nothing to do with Freud's psychoanalysis. It's a psychoanalysis that was, lots of its main values and contributions were kind of disappeared. This has been pointed out, as you know, by people like Adorno and Carlos Alberto Castillo, who have been very clear in showing the role of psychoanalysis in understanding society, not only understanding individuals, but understanding society and helping sociologists and all anthropologists to understand the development of communities. So this point is something that we would like to emphasize a lot, and you'll see it throughout the book. You'll see, and that's why I'm talking about the spirit of the book, how it's recovering. I would like to call it the initial attitude of psychoanalysts towards the world. And what to say about mutual analysis? Mutual analysis
Excuse me, Alberto. Alberto, you have become muted for some reason.
Oh my God, something happens.
That's wonderful. We can hear you again. Can you just go back 2 sentences, perhaps?
Okay, yeah, probably that happened. I don't know how did it happen, actually, but that happened probably when I was beginning to talk about mutual analysis, probably.
Exactly.
Well, I guess, okay, so yes, what I was trying to point out is that mutual analysis is a much wider and much more revolutionary concept than what is generally being accepted. Mutual analysis is present in every psychoanalytic process. Every analysant does it, although it is done in a somewhat unconscious and I would say covered manner. Every patient, every analysant somehow analyzes his analyst, or in secret, in private. Probably he doesn't give the analyst his own insights, but that's something that happens in all process. And the opening for that idea was done certainly by FERENCZI in his experience with Elizabeth Severn, which was such a revolutionary moment when he had the courage to really tell us all that had happened there. And in our case, and this is probably the final thing I would like to say, is the gratitude that we in our program in Colombia, as it was mentioned, we've worked for many years with homeless, so-called mentally ill people as psychoanalysts, using psychoanalysis. And this is a license, if I would like to call it like that, that we got, and I myself got from Sandor Ferenczi. I mean, if I hadn't read about Sandor Ferenczi, I would have never thought that I could remain to be an analyst. I could keep my identity, working with severe psychosis, working with homeless people, and later working in the peace process of Colombia, working with people who are kind of moved from being for many years fighting in the jungle of Colombia and have been reintegrated into society. I've always have thought that at the most I could have said, I'm doing applied psychoanalysis, or I'm doing psychoanalytic psychotherapy while I'm doing that. Thanks to people like Ferenczi, we learn a very important final thing, that we don't have to renounce our psychoanalytic identity when we go into fields, when we help in fields that are not exactly the typical couch activity of analysts. This is a very strong point for us. And for us, it's one of the main legacies of Sandor Ferenczi, that we can be analysts in many fields, and we don't have to use all of us have different hats. In my case, I'm also a psychiatrist, I'm also a physician, but I've been able to do things in all these fields thanks to Sandor Ferenczi, keeping my main identity as a psychoanalyst. And with this, I want to thank you once more for making this process possible. And my colleague Miguel is probably soon going to give you much more specific data on specific topics we kind of talk about in the book. Thank you, Shlomit. Thank you all of you. Now you're muted, Shlomit. Now you're muted.
Thank you. Now we're completely mutual, you and I.
Absolutely.
I wanted to thank you very much, and also to say that I think your work is a wonderful example of the way both theory and the spirit of the theory can be implemented. And so thank you very much, both for the information and for this sort of illustration. We will now move on to hear our second author, Miguel Gutiérrez, and it's my pleasure to introduce him. Miguel is full professor of the Center for Psychosocial Studies and Psychology program of the Universidad del Rosario in Bogota, Colombia. Dr. Gutiérrez is a psychologist from the Pontificia Universidad Javeriana. Did I say any of that right, Miguel? Yeah, okay. And he obtained his MA in psychoanalysis and PhD in psychology from the Universidad de Buenos Aires. He is a member of the World Association of Psychoanalysis and the New Lacanian School. He has taught at different universities in Colombia and Argentina and worked as a clinician at different mental health institutions in both countries. He has worked with Colombian soldiers and police officers who fought in war zones, as well as with other persons with psychological difficulties derived from the armed conflict. He is the author of various publications in index journals on issues related to trauma, art, and mental illness, and psychosocial interventions in armed conflict scenarios. He is author of the books Confusion of Tongues, A Return to Sandor Ferenczi, that has seen light in Routledge 218, Art and Psychoanalysis, Unique Artistic Inventions of Singular Subjects, seen light in 2018 as well in Universidad del Rosario publishing company, and co-edited with Beatriz Garcia Moreno, and SÁNDOR FERENCZI, A Critical Introduction, co-authored with Alberto Fergusson. Miguel, please.
Well, thank you very much, Shlomit, and thank you all for organizing this great event. Thank you to our rector, to Anner, to Gila, to Alberto, to Ofrit, and to all of you who are connected today for taking the time to listen to us and learn about our work. First, I would like to mention some personal history. From very early in my clinical training, I became interested in FERENCZI. I was deeply interested in the mental functioning of psychotic patients, and I would say initially, very naively, was interested in understanding how the mind of a psychotic patient worked. There were obviously the most common references: Freud's reading of the Schreber case, Melanie Klein, a bit of Winnicott, and very frequently I was referred to the concept of splitting in FERENCZI. Nonetheless, none of my teachers knew exactly where I could find that, or what that concept really meant, or how it was different from the concept of splitting in Klein or of Spaltung in Freud. I quickly found out that FERENCZI was an author that was not actually read and that had a marginal place in the history of psychoanalysis. This could only awaken my curiosity even more. As I delved deeper into his work, I was amazed because I could see that he, very early in the history of psychoanalysis, touched the most crucial topics of psychoanalysis. How should analysts be trained? How can you work with severely disturbed patients? When does an analysis end? Can the classical technique of psychoanalysis allow you to work with all patients, or is it necessary to introduce changes in order to treat certain patients? How do we deal in our clinical practice, which works with words and language, with those parts of the human psyche and experience which cannot be articulated in language? In this book, we wanted to present FERENCZI as the innovative thinker and psychoanalyst he is. How he was such a great clinician, a great devotee of psychoanalysis, how he took risks, moved by his clinical comprehensions and skills, and how he, as well as other analysts of the first and second generation, were politically active and believed that psychoanalysis had a place in the social sphere and could contribute to the liberty and welfare of society as a whole. Psychoanalysis was not something that happened only inside private offices. I lived for some years in Argentina, where I studied my master's in psychoanalysis and my PhD in psychology. Both my theses were on SÁNDOR FERENCZI, and when Aner and Tahir brought us the project of writing a new book on FERENCZI, I was not sure what could be the novel angle for this publication. With Alberto, we talked a lot about the book before writing, and really getting this that Alberto mentions as the spirit of the book truly embedded in our writing. Now I can say I'm very happy with this book. I think it achieved its purpose of being both an introductory book, interesting and readable for someone who has not had a close contact with FERENCZI's work, and a book that offers new readings and perspectives on FERENCZI that we'll hope will be of interest and inspiration for analysts with a deeper understanding of FERENCZI's work. In the next few minutes, I would like to refer to the general scheme of the book, so the people that are listening to us today have a general perspective of the whole book, and I will make emphasis on certain points of these chapters. Obviously, the book begins with an introduction, and then we have our first strong chapter, the democratization of psychoanalysis, SÁNDOR FERENCZI from forced disappearance to resurrection. which presents what Alberto has spoken to us about. Ferenczi's great liberty and creativity, his social and political implication, and I would say the political roots of his changes in the psychoanalytic technique. Then, in the following chapters, we present in detail Ferenczi's biographical outline, his upbringing with a leftist intellectual family in Budapest, which owned a bookstore, which had an important impact in the intellectual life of the city. Then we mention Ferenczi's studies in medicine, his first pre-analytical writings, and the curious fact that Ferenczi was asked to write a comment on Freud's interpretation of dreams, and he was actually not very fond of it. Obviously, later in his lifetime, he will be most captivated by Freud's work. Freud and Ferenczi met in 1908 in an encounter facilitated by Gustav Jung and Philip Stein. Since then, their relationship became quite close and with different angles. They were colleagues, friends, patient and analyst, and towards the end of Ferenczi's life, distant because of unresolvable technical and theoretical disputes. During those first years, Ferenczi became a translator and divulgator of Freud's work. There is a moving picture, which probably many of you have seen, of Freud and Ferenczi in the frontier of Papa in Hungary during the First World War, where Ferenczi also worked on the translation of the 3 essays on a theory of sexuality. It is worth remembering that on Freud's trip to America for his conference on Clark University, Freud traveled with both Jung and Ferenczi. If you have seen David Cronenberg's movie, A Dangerous Method, you can see a brief appearance of Ferenczi boarding the ship. I don't know if there are other movies in which Ferenczi has been represented. There are certain chapters that dedicate especially to certain concepts of introduced by Ferenczi, very crucial concepts for the history and theory of psychoanalysis. Of course, there is a chapter on one of the most controversial aspects of Ferenczi, which were his clinical and technical innovations. So there we can display everything that has to do with relaxation and neocatharsis, the active technique, and finally, his mutual analysis, probably the most controversial. Thalassa and bioanalysis, I would say that Ferenczi produced probably 2 of the strangest books in the history of psychoanalysis. One of them, not intended for publication, was the clinical diary, which I will refer to later on. And the other one was his book, Thalassa, A Theory of Genitality. Published in 1924, it is a bold insertion of what he names bioanalysis. Taking into account Haeckel's work and Lamarck's evolutionary theories, Ferenczi links the history of evolution to the development of sexuality from childhood to adulthood. Freud in 1933 mentions this project in Ferenczi's obituary and states that, this I quote Freud, "This little book is a biological rather than a psychoanalytic study. It is an application of the attitudes and insights associated with psychoanalysis to the biology of the sexual processes, and beyond them, to organic life in general. It was perhaps the boldest application of psychoanalysis that was ever attempted. It is probable that sometime in the future, there will really be a bioanalysis, as Ferenczi has prophesied." Up to then the quote. So Freud says one of the strangest and boldest books in the history of psychoanalysis. It could be considered even delirious, as he connects the history of human sexuality with the great millenary transformations of the Earth's surface. But what is a key truth, let us say, that transcends the creative and mind-blowing ideas of the book is that of the body. Ferenczi thought of the word bioanalysis, which lead us to think, how can psychoanalysis touch the body? Can it transform it? How? Can an interpretation in some way produce transformative effects in the body? With this, Ferenczi opens a wide path of thought. We have another chapter regarding the end of analysis, and I believe in this book we present a novel reading of Ferenczi's article on the end of analysis and how we can understand this end. I hope the readers can contribute to further understanding this fascinating and crucial point of the psychoanalytic treatments and training. The term Ferenczi uses, and that is correctly translated as exhaustion, is Erschöpfung. I will not spoil the reading of this new understanding of the end of analysis, but I will anticipate that what we can find is that at the end of an analysis, in the termination of its experience, it is not only the exhaustion of the experience of the unconscious, but an absolutely original creation on behalf of the subject. This creation is not something that is elaborated ex nihilo or out of the blue, but precisely a remnant once the reduction of the unconscious to the analysis has isolated that singular formation of the subject that can allow him a new relation with his reality and with his own psyche. We have another chapter regarding Ferenczi's interest in the child psychology, his concern for the suffering of the child and how a better understanding of the child can lead has an effect also in the way children are brought up and educated. Throughout his work, Ferenczi makes explicit his interest in what psychoanalysis can contribute to the matters of education and upbringing. He is aware that psychoanalysis is suspicious of giving advice, but believes it can shed light more than in how to raise children, in how not to raise them. In his lecture, The Adaptation of the Family to the Child, he inverts the common conception that it is the child who should adapt to his family and to his environment. Instead, Ferenczi believes that it is the family that should become aware of the psychic process of the child and be of aid to him to help him understand what he feels and needs. Ferenczi criticizes the adult hypocrisy in presenting themselves to the child as immaculate and idealized figures whose bodies and mind function perfectly and are devoid of sexual impulses. Later in our book, we go to Ferenczi's latest writings. We did a very close reading of Ferenczi's extensive correspondence with Freud and how it shows how their relationship becomes each time more distant and more bitter. In his last years, Ferenczi produced abundant material on the theory of trauma and on therapeutic practice in relation to trauma. In these last writings, we believe that there is a distance from Freud ideas and that they constitute an original contribution to psychoanalysis, which continues to be most relevant and pertinent today. These latest works have raised diverse reactions in the psychoanalytic community, initially with intense criticism and rejection, and more recently with interest and praise. Works like his clinical diary and his notes and fragments illustrate his developing ideas on trauma and psychic mechanisms involved in it, rather than presenting finished theories. Alberto mentioned the work Confusion of Tongues Between the Adult and the Child, in which we believe Ferenczi presents a trauma theory that is a novel comprehension of trauma that is an innovation produced by Ferenczi for the psychoanalytic comprehension of this phenomenon. I mentioned that Thalassa was the first of psychoanalysis. The second one is Ferenczi's clinical diary. It's one of those most unique documents. It is at the same time a pinnacle of his analysis and analytic process and sessions, a crucible for the development of bold and groundbreaking ideas on the theory of trauma and technique, and a recount of his analysis and relationship with Freud. Later in the book, we mention what happens to Ferenczi afterwards, how he is, in a sense, repressed from the history of psychoanalysis. And we mention some very beautiful obituaries. The Hungarian author Sándor Márai presents a beautiful obituary of Ferenczi. Melanie Klein, in her autobiographical notes, mentions the following. She says, "There is much that I have to thank Ferenczi for. One thing that he conveyed to me and strengthened in me was the conviction in the existence of the unconscious and its importance for mental life. I also enjoyed being in touch with somebody who was a man of unusual gifts. He had a strike of genius." I'm happy to mention that today, in a few minutes, in Hungary, the first volume of the complete works of Sándor Ferenczi will be presented. It's amazing that this was not done before, and I'm not sure if Judith Mesarosh is here, but I want to congratulate her for this wonderful work. I will finish just 1 minute, so mentioning two things. One, what Ferenczi wrote about, what Freud wrote about Ferenczi. He said, "Hungary, so close to Austria geographically and so distant from it scientifically, until now has not provided psychoanalysis but a single collaborator, Sándor Ferenczi, but such that is valid for an entire association." And finally, Freud, in his obituary after Ferenczi's death, mentions that Ferenczi's writings made all analysts his disciples. And I believe we are in that point. No doubt we are all disciples of Ferenczi. And we hope that the readers that have followed, that will read the book and follow us till its end, will find in it novel understandings of Ferenczi's writings and allow themselves to be amazed and moved by the novelty that awaits in this short, but I believe wonderful book. Thank you, Shlomit. You are muted, Shlomit.
Sorry. Thank you, Miguel, very much for this clear, concise description of the outline of the book. I think it's very helpful for people and encouraging to delve into it. And I also think that the point where you ended, in the way that we're all Ferenczi's disciples, and actually talking about his legacy and relevance today, is an excellent introduction for our next speaker, Dr. Gila Ofer, who will be discussing the relevance of Ferenczi for contemporary psychoanalysis. And I will just take a moment to introduce Gila. Gila Ofer, PhD, is a clinical psychologist, training psychoanalyst, and group analyst. Dr. Ofer is, I'm thinking how interesting it is that all the speakers are into groups and social issues. This is probably not an accident. Dr. Ofer is the founder and past president of the Tel Aviv Institute of Contemporary Psychoanalysis and the founding member of the Israeli Institute of Group Analysis. And she serves on the faculty of both institutes and at the postgraduate school for psychoanalytic psychotherapy at Tel Aviv University. Dr. Ofer has been the chair of the group analytics section and board member of the EFPP, and later a conjoint member of the board as the coordinator of Eastern European countries of the EFPP. Currently, she's the editor of the EFPP Psychoanalytic Psychotherapy Review. She has published her work in leading journals and presented her work and taught in Israel, Europe, East Asia, and the US. Her edited book, A Bridge Over Troubled Water, Conflicts and Reconciliation in Groups and Society, was published in 2017. Gila, please. You are on mute. We pass this on from speaker to speaker. Can you unmute yourself?
Yes.
Wonderful.
Okay, thank you, Shlomit, and thank you, Miguel and Alberto, for your wonderful short introduction to Sándor Ferenczi's book and legacy. And what I'm going to talk about is about Ferenczi ahead of his time and his contribution to the relational approach. Let me start with someone else who was ahead of his time. During his whole life, Vincent van Gogh painted hundreds of pictures, but sold only one, the Red Vineyard. Today, his pictures are sold for millions of dollars. The question is why? Why this great artist couldn't get the recognition he deserved during his lifetime? Same question applies to Ferenczi. Why such a great psychoanalyst, at the time tremendously appreciated by Freud, by other analysts, by people from Europe and the United States who traveled to Hungary to be analyzed by him, like Clara Thompson and Elizabeth Sever and others? Why was he almost forgotten for half a century? Why incriminating him as psychotic and hiding his articles led to overlooking his contributions to our theory and practice? Why did he become the dissociated part of psychoanalysis? There might be various answers to this phenomenon of great minds that are forgotten because they are ahead of their time. Some of the answers, I believe, can be found in Ferenczi's own theory. Confusion of tongues, social context, and dissociations are elements in his theory that can explain this. Freud's ambition was to include psychoanalysis as a science. For this, total abstinence was required from the analyst. Ferenczi brought another direction, that of intersubjectivity countertransfers as an important element, a language not appreciated by the social context at the time. So he became the dissociated element of psychoanalysis. As we heard before from the authors of the book, from Miguel and Alberto, and from others, Ferenczi indeed was ahead of his time. His therapeutic investigation led to theoretical, clinical, and technical discoveries. Rahman, in 2007, outlined 5 areas of Ferenczi's contributions. The first one, an ethos of clinical experimentation and empirically based clinical theory. Second, introduction of clinical empathy. He was the first one to use empathy and not Kohut. Third, analysis of trauma in difficult cases. And fourth, development of the confusion of tongues theory. And last, he laid the foundation for a relational perspective in psychoanalysis. I will refer here to this 5th area, foundation for a relational perspective in psychoanalysis. Ferenczi developed an intersubjective outlook, a postmodern way of thinking, recognizing possibilities of coexistence, of paradoxical mental contents, of the importance of the context, of the field, of the use of countertransference and enactment within the transference-countertransference matrix. He changed the way we think about the impact of the analyst on transference, of the analyst's subjectivity on the patient. However, he was relatively unnoticed, almost anonymous to the English-speaking professional world until 1988, when his clinical diary that was mentioned before was published in English. I wish to further explore his impact on the relational approach by relating to 2 main themes: dissociation as a theoretical concept and self-disclosure as a technical theme. First, some statistics taken from the PEP. Regarding dissociation, approximately 1,143 papers on dissociation were published from 1910 to 1980. Between 1990 and 2000, 2 years after the publication of the clinical theory, immediately 932, followed by 1644 a decade later, and 2547 between 2010 and 2020. Can you imagine the difference in numbers? Although there might be other significant factors which contributed to this change in referring to dissociation, it can also be assumed from these numbers that the publication of Ferenczi's clinical diary was the turning point in the thinking of psychoanalysts, or at least contributed quite a bit to the internalization of this term and its meaning to psychoanalysis in general, and the relational approach in particular. Not all authors and not all articles mention Ferenczi in their references. In this context, it was said that Winnicott didn't want to read Ferenczi because he felt he couldn't differentiate between what was Ferenczi's thinking and what was his own. In psychoanalytic explorations, he writes, and I quote, "I never know what I got out of glancing at Ferenczi," end of quote. I will explore the impact of Ferenczi's work by examining the contributions of two distinguished relational psychoanalysts, Philip Bromberg, who wrote extensively on dissociation, and Jody Davis, who has actually expanded the use of self-disclosure. Bromberg's rich and illuminating papers on dissociation, 28 on dissociation, started in 1989. I will refer here to what he explicates in the first three. To remind you, 1989 is 1 year after the publication in English of clinical diary. In 1989, in his discussion of case presentation by Friedman, he introduces the concept and process of dissociation. He says that there is almost always some history of gross and often sustained psychological trauma that was responded to by dissociation, so profound that in some cases, the primary diagnosis would most accurately be that of severe dissociative disorder. The patient is trying to keep the analyst from becoming someone felt as trustworthy and reliable. Trusting has led only to trauma, unbearable shame, and a betrayal of the security, and she has found maintaining herself and her state of self-containment only through dissociation. In 1991, in his paper on knowing one's patient inside out, the aesthetics of unconscious communication, he discusses trauma, dissociation, and regression in the context of unconscious communication as transferential element of unsymbolic, unmetabolized experience. He adds that the concept of dissociation plays a major role and has wide clinical characteristics in broader analytic perspective. But only in 1994, in his seminal paper, Speak, That I May Hear You, Some Reflections on Dissociation, Reality, and Psychoanalytic Listening, he asserts that dissociation is not inherently pathological. It is intrinsically an adaptational talent that represents the very nature of consciousness, and it's not fragmentation. I quote, "Trauma and dissociation breed discontinuous realities in every human being and are not amenable to interpretation," end of quote. In connection to this, he also writes, I quote, "The analyst's self-revelation is not just permissible, but necessary." Bromberg's papers on echo Ferenczi's theoretical and clinical conceptualization, which are embedded in an intersubjective field. Ferenczi said that the infant mind is in the phase of total dependency is formed and shaped within the relation to the other. It is permeable, self-other, and not separate. The child's automatic survival response to a parent who doesn't recognize the child's dependency needs is fear and dissociation. It is a defensive dissociation undertaken in order to reunite with the other. Since this happens in the intersubjective field, cure can happen only in the intersubjective field. In analysis, we aim at revival of dissociated parts, allowing regression in order to bring out authentic expression of the self. FERENCZI, like Bromberg, encouraged creativity, activity, playfulness, intrapsychic and interpersonal experiencing in the analysis. Although Bromberg's conceptualization is very similar to Ferenczy's theory, we know that Bromberg's conceptualization was widely accepted, whereas Ferenczi's widely rejected, possibly because he was ahead of his time. Let us look now at self-disclosure. I wish to examine it through the work of Jody Davis, who is well known for her use and explication of self-disclosure, as well as of dissociation. Looking again at the statistics, from 1910 until 1980, there were 53 papers referring to self-disclosure. And following the publication of the English version of the clinical diary, in the next decade, 609 such papers, followed by 956 during the first decade of this century. 24,852 papers referring to self-disclosure in the English language were published until today. Jody Davis' well-known papers with her brave, daring views of self-disclosure were all published after 1990, 2 years after the publication of the clinical diary. In her paper, Love in the Afternoon, a relational reconsideration of desire and dread in the countertransference in 1994, and the one from 1998, Between the Disclosure and Foreclosure of Erotic Transference, Countertransference, Can Psychoanalysis Find a Place for Adult Sexuality? She addresses the issue of self-disclosure. She says that it is important to note that such disclosure is one among many therapeutic options. She argues that there is no such thing as a perfectly analyzed analyst, and that we are all subject to the same unconscious infantile pools as our patients. She brings in a more direct challenge to our institutional prohibitions of pleasure and sexuality in the analytic relationship, and discusses her participation in erotic transference countertransference enactments with 2 patients, including self-disclosure of her erotic feelings toward the patients. She extends her argument by describing benign and malignant forms of seductiveness in terms of the analyst's capacity to recognize and be responsible for her own participation in the erotic transference countertransference enactment. Following these papers, she was criticized by quite a few analysts, and it took some years and a long debate until her ideas became accepted by a large part of the psychoanalytic community. Ferenczi believed that the analyst's personality and his countertransference are critical for the analysis and has an immense impact on the patient. The countertransference modifies and forms the transference of the patient, and not the other way around. The analyst should let the patient know about his own errors and can share with him his misgivings. Self-disclosure of the analyst is sometimes recommended in such cases. Ferenczi took this to the extreme in doing mutual analysis. Later, he rejected this option. However, self-disclosure remained as a possible, sometimes plausible way of intervention. Although both Bromberg and Davies hardly mention FERENCZI in their writing, we can see that this theory had a significant impact on their thinking as well as on other relational theories. In 1993, Lou Aron and Adrian Harris published their book on the legacy of FERENCZI, as well as established the center dedicated to it. One can say that FERENCZI became officially an ancestor of the relational tradition, ancestor and not a ghost. Let me go back to the question I asked at the beginning of this talk. How can we ensure that the story of FERENCZI doesn't repeat itself? For me, one of the main takeaways from the delayed recognition of the importance of FERENCZI's theory is that we should be open to the contribution of other voices, even though they might not be in the mainstream of the current thinking, and may present views and theory that are conflict with the prevailing approaches and theories. And I end here, and thank you.
Gila, thank you very much for your talk and for underlining the relevance of FERENCZI for contemporary psychoanalysis and in specific the relational tradition. And I will just mention that at these very days just now, we are having an international colloquium online regarding self-disclosure and self-revelation in the International Institute for Relational Psychoanalysis, for whoever is interested to follow it. And this it also resonates the strength, I think, of FERENCZI's legacies. We are now moving towards the final part of our evening, and this will involve a conversation between Anel, who has already been introduced, and the editor of the book, and Miguel and Alberto. And anyone wishing to join in or introduce any question, please write in the chat, or you can, if you're not comfortable addressing everybody, you can address it to me and also ask for the floor to speak. So I am inviting Anel to begin this part of our evening.
Thank you, Shlomit, and thank you everybody for coming. I first want to thank Miguel and Alberto for writing this wonderful book. By the way, I'm not the editor of the book, I'm the editor of the series. Miguel and Alberto write so brilliantly, they did not need an editor of the book. Their book is a gem in our series. And also I want to thank Tahir and Yael for helping me in the series they're doing. I thought of Alberto saying, I'm not sure if I got you right, but I thought you were saying that that mutual analysis is really an indispensable dimension of every psychoanalysis. And yet no one practiced mutual analysis as FERENCZI did. We don't do that. He went by far much more extreme than a regular self-revelation, if you can say so. What do you think of this? That actually his technique was not adopted by us analysts, Miguel, Alberto.
Thank you, Anna, for asking that. It's a very important point. Yes, certainly FERENCZI went much further than any other analyst has done, and any other analyst can. That's why the point I wanted to make was sort of that this mutual analysis is something that somehow has happened in a certain, up to a certain level, in a certain way, always. I mean, analysans, people who are under analysis, or let's call them patients, no? They also listen, they do sort of the same task that the analyst does somehow, and they listen to him, they see the analyst, and they have their own hypothesis, and they have their own interpretations. And so in one of the things that I value so much about FERENCZI is that this thing that it's done in a sort of a secret way, in a sort of a, not in an open way, has happened always. And he had the courage to do things, to really do it, and do it up to a much more extreme way. And if you look at the how we began to work with well, let me say it from another point. The fact that there are two things that he was his courage was to first disclose things from himself, right? To really actively and consciously disclose things, which are, as Gila now said, it's something that's lots of consciousness of that, and many analysts are talking about nowadays, but that wasn't so before FERENCZI. And the second thing is that the so-called patient isn't the same level. No, that's part of what I call the democratization of analysis, that this change ended this idea of the analyst being in a more kind of powerful or knowledgeable situation. It really became, the two parties really became equals, and are the two things that I think hadn't happened and begun to happen thanks to what he did.
But Alberto, I wonder if the two parts are really equal, because the inherited situation is that one person asks for help for another person, and that's an asymmetry, an inherited asymmetry in the relations.
Well, one thing is that they are certainly not the same and doing the same sort of task, right? But that doesn't mean that they are not equal that they should not be equal in power, in dignity, in their possibility to say what happens. Of course, their job is not the same, right? But that doesn't mean the fact that they're just doing different roles, let's say. But the fact that FERENCZI showed us how this could be suddenly interchanged for a second at least, gives us an idea that this is something that happens only because of the decision of a role, a different role, but it should have nothing to do with power or with status or things like that, no? And I think that's the point that changes, no? We've tried a bit of that with Miguel, no? Up to a certain point. Of course, it's kind of private to see if we can do some mutual analysis between the two of us, right? And we've done a bit of that, right? This is, of course, a very sort of experimental sort of thing. But so the point is not that they're certainly doing different things, but not that one should have more power than the other. No, the fact that one asks for help for the other and the other. I mean, we could put it the other way. I mean, the person who usually has the power is the one who pays, no? And typically the patient pays. So if we were going to talk about power, no, the patient could have more power, right? Because he is the one that's going to pay, no? So I don't know. That's what I could comment on your comment, Anna.
Thank you. Miguel, would you like to comment?
Yes, well, what I could mention is, I think this technical and clinical innovations in FERENCZI are a necessary reaction to how he sees treatment. You know? Looking for the faults in treatment, not only in the mental functioning of the patient, but in that of the analyst. And I think as an analyst, FERENCZI invited us to be very sensible to what So in what way an analyst intervenes, interprets, and how that helps and serves, helps or becomes an obstacle maybe for the better outcomes of the treatment. So in a sense, FERENCZI is not comfortable just following the classical technique or being an orthodox patient, but he's very sensible to when changes in the technique are required, not because they make the analyst more comfortable, but because they are needed by the patient. The question is, how does the analyst know that when he introduces changes in the technique, he's reacting to the needs of the patient or when he's reacting to his own needs? And that's why I think FERENCZI is so demanding regarding the training of the analyst, and how reaching the end of analysis was such a concern for him. And like he was such a free spirit, he was willing to go as far as he needed to go for the benefit of his patient. And in many ways, well, mutual analysis is it's mind-blowing. It's very difficult to think that that would become a technique in Freud's time or in ours.
Yes. Would you say that Elizabeth Severn, his famous patient from the diary, was also, they were sort of collaborating between them? She also has to give the credit of being the first of inventing the trauma theory, because she was really his partner. What role did she have?
Do you want to mention something of that, Alberto, or do you want me to say
You can, yes, but I certainly want, but go ahead, I'll go after you.
I think that another attitude of FERENCZI, I think, is that he took very seriously everything that his patients said. No, he didn't treat that just as a resistance. He really took a deep interest in everything a patient said, and I think, of course, in a sense, this final trauma theory is indissociable from FERENCZI and Severn. Probably it could not occur only with Severn or only with FERENCZI, but it's the fascinating thing. It was produced and understood and formalized by the experience they had in mutual analysis.
So they both jointly gave birth to the trauma theory. I think that's right. Alberto, would you add?
Yes, thank you for asking that, Anna, because yes, my answer is yes, not only in that example, certainly in that example regarding the trauma theory and the role of Elizabeth, but I think this has happened all the time. When you're involved, like we did in our program, trying to kind of discover a new technique or come with a new technique for handling and seeing what we could do with the homeless, so-called mentally ill people, we, thanks to FERENCZI, all that we did, and this is sincere, all we did was to listen to the technique that was developed by our clients, by our patients, and I am certainly sure that all the technique that is now acknowledged that it was discovered by Miguel or by me, that's false. No, I really have to give them, all the patients, they were the ones that discovered how to do it. The only thing that we did, which might be something to acknowledge, is that we really listened to them and heard from them what we should do, and we did it. No, and that's what probably is something we did. But they were the one really who come with the technique. I think not only the technique, also the theory in their own language. But I think this has happened throughout the history. I think that, yes, there are lots of patients on the couch who have never been quoted, who are the real authors of many psychoanalytic theories, no? And that's something very complicated, no? But I think it's true in Elizabeth and in FERENCZI, and it's true in many other cases.
Yes.
Alberto, as Anil, sorry, as we have just a few minutes left, I was wondering if there is anyone from the audience that would like to present Alberto to or Miguel with a question. I see one question here asking Alberto if you have a book that describes your technique.
Yes, I'm going to put it in the chat. Lots of what we've published is in Spanish, but I'm going to put basically one that is in English, that it's called Accompanied Self-Rehabilitation, and you can find it by in Amazon. Where is it? You find it, Miguel? It's in Amazon. Where do you get it?
Yes, it can be acquired as an ebook. Yes.
As an ebook, right? Yeah, and it's called Accompanied Self-Rehabilitation, and I'm certainly the author of that. Yes, thank you for asking that.
I am wondering if this book also includes any reference to you approaching homeless people. I can't think how amazing that must be to approach.
Just a bit, Sholomit. Just a bit, no? Most of what it really describes that isn't published in Spanish books, which I'll also try to put the reference just in case.
And just in the spirit of FERENCZI, I will steal one more minute to present another question from the audience. It was presented in Hebrew, asking if you think that the technique of mutual analysis, or the spirit of it, does it not create the dangers of boundary crossings, especially among the sexes?
Miguel?
Treat in general a FERENCZI's boundary violation, which actually occurred.
Right.
I would say definitely, but that's why I think that these technical innovations, and maybe you can say that of classical technique, cannot just be applied a one-size-fits-all. I think that's also in FERENCZI spirit. Maybe Elizabeth Severin was such a unique person and had such unique psychological needs that FERENCZI needed to develop a custom-made technique for her that was mutual analysis. I think it becomes absurd if we say, no, we have to do all patients mutual analysis or all patients not mutual analysis. I think FERENCZI spirit is really search what your patient needs. What do you have to do to go deeper and help in a much more radical way your patient? So I think it's in that sense. Of course, it's very risky.
So it's like what you're saying is that a violation is something that cannot be objectively defined, that for each patient, something else might mean a violation.
I think that, and I think that's what makes it so difficult, such a demanding for the clinician. And why is it so difficult just to develop a Ferencian technique? That's why I think we've talked about a lot today of the Ferencian spirit. It's probably more appropriate to think of that
than to speak of rules and techniques, because it is so contextualized. Alberto, so many people are asking for you to please write the name of your book in the chat, addressed to everybody. So maybe while I thank everybody, you can write down the name of the book. And as Anil said, the success of an event is dependent on keeping strict hold of the times. So we've reached the end of our event, and I would like to thank all of you for being with us today. And special thanks, of course, to Dr. Chain, and to Alberto Fergusson, and to Miguel Gutiérrez, and to Gila Ofer, and to Anil And thank you all very much. And I hope we somehow all find ways to keep in touch.